Welcome to another episode of the Loadout Music Podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with a wide range of music personalities, from rock and roll Hall of Famers to Grammy winners and today's rising stars. Recorded from the Old Rock House in St. Louis, Missouri, here's your host, Aaron Perlut.
Welcome back to the Loadout Music Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Perlut, as always. And today our guest is someone who might need an introduction, but he probably shouldn't. That's because he's been called the king of classic rock and worked with a who's who of rock and roll Hall of Famers, including Neil Young, Robert Plant, Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Allman Brothers, Rush, Judas Priest, Widespread Panic, Nancy Wilson of Heart, and the list goes on and on and on. Tom Lipsky has led CMC International Sanctuary Records, Loud and Proud, Carry On Music, and now he focuses on working with a variety of veteran artists, placing their catalogs with investment funds. Tom, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's a real privilege to have you on. And I'm sure we'll cover this because it threads through the needle of your entire career. But I mean, I think it would be an understatement to say that the music industry has evolved over the past 50 years. And you seem like you've been right at the center of that.
Yeah, I mean, I started in the days of the cassette, a little bit after 8-tracks. 8-track was my fan period, but cassettes were when I got involved from a business standpoint. And now we're all things not physical. So yeah, I've seen tremendous evolution in the technology. I've seen a lot of evolution in the industry, which, you know, if you go back a few decades, was led primarily by a handful of major labels, and they dominated every aspect of the business. Whereas today, the independent community has as much weight in the market as the major labels, and they're creative hubs all over the world in small towns. It's not just New York and LA anymore. It's just a whole different type of approach. And I really like the way the business has evolved in most cases.
It's fascinating.
Some things I'm unhappy about, but I love the fact that independent creators, independent companies, labels, publishers, producers, that they've been able to have such an impact standing toe to toe with the much bigger companies.
Yeah, it's fascinating in that, like everything else, the internet has truly democratized the music industry, but not so much when you first got into it. And how did you first get into the music industry?
Let's see. So originally, I was involved with live entertainment. I worked for a company called Music Fair, which was sort of like the Nederlander company that ran festival facilities. And Music Fair was a theater in the round group. Well, while running their Baltimore theater for a number of years, I met everybody in the business. So every attorney representing every artist, every agent, booking them through the circuit. You know, I just networked with a lot of people, became friends. And from there, I decided to get into managing artists. And I actually, through a mutual attorney that another company and I were both using in New York, an entertainment attorney, I became familiar with this company, CMC, located in North Carolina. And long story short, I ended up moving to North Carolina to join that company. And then a few years later, I sort of led the transition from it being a localized booking agency and management company into representing the recordings and becoming an independent label.
So when you first joined CMC, what kind of role did you step into there?
Initially, I was an artist manager working with a handful of groups. But as time went on, there seemed to be a lot more opportunity with recorded music. I think, you know, in the 90s, independent labels were beginning to come into their own. And after years of knocking on doors, trying to get labels to embrace music that I felt passionate about, a decision was made that we would start releasing the music ourselves instead of spending all of our days trying to convince others to release our music. And I sort of accidentally fell into the veteran artist community. And, you know, in the beginning, when you start up and you don't have the resources that the majors have, you don't have the network and the infrastructure, you just look for opportunities. And the first couple of opportunities that presented themselves were with established artists, the metal band Accept, Yngwie Malmsteen, And I worked with a gentleman named Bob Chiappardi at Concrete Marketing, who was connected to every piece of rock and roll. If you were putting out a rock record, you hired Bob's company to work the record. We became good friends, and he extended my initial relationships. And I found myself finding incredible opportunity that I couldn't believe existed with the veteran artist market. I remember reading the article years ago about Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and how they got letters in the mail from Atlantic letting them know that their contract was being terminated or the option wasn't being picked up, whatever. So you think of that group. I thought of that group at the time. They're one of the building blocks of that label. They played a major role in building the industry that we're all involved in. And they didn't even get a phone call. They didn't have an executive fly out to meet with them at their home and tell them that the company's going in a different direction. They got a form letter. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's a terrible way of doing business. And I can imagine the people, artists that have done so much would be even more insulted than I could imagine to get a notification that way. And second of all, why in the world were they letting people like this go? And the more I dug into it, the more I found that a lot of artists that I grew up on and was fans of from the beginning were available, looking for a new recording situation. And then it became a matter of convincing the initial artist to take a gamble on me and on my company, and join what we were trying to do. And certain artists didn't, but certain artists did. Ones that didn't in the beginning did later on. And it just sort of mushroomed very quickly. With CMC, the label started with the help of an investment group over in Switzerland, of all places. That's how we actually got it off the ground. And there was a gentleman in Switzerland named Christoph Berger, who was sort of my counterpart in the foreign market. But then as time went on, as it focused more on these established artists, it became more of an American company. And with that being the case, I signed the first few, but then in a heartbeat, my attorney introduced me to BMG Entertainment and Polygram. And representatives of both made offers to do a joint venture. They saw, I was sort of a hybrid. You have your catalog division that only sells old records. You got your mainstream division that sells all new records. And here I was selling new records by catalog artists. So I didn't really fit here. I didn't really fit there, but a niche was there. And BMG really respected that. I loved working with them. And we worked together for about 6 years. CMC became one of their top several non-proprietary distribution labels. The volume was really good. And it wasn't because we had hit records, we didn't. But where everybody, tried to focus on getting that one record out of 10 or 20 or whatever that would do big business, I put it that, I tried to focus on hitting singles and doubles, but never striking out. And with the kind of artists I was signing, what I knew was that they never strike out. They have a fan base that's there, maybe not as big as during their heyday, granted, but their fans aren't going anywhere. They're connected to those artists. They love those artists. So I knew there was a platform to build. And, pretty soon it just grew. It was great in those days. I mean, I was all over the place. I signed, one of my first signings once we connected with BMG was Lynyrd Skynyrd. And that's when Billy Powell, Leon, and Gary Rossington were the original three of the original founders. They were in the band at that time. So I was, dazzled by being in a room with Gary Rossington, for example. But, they understood what we were trying to do. They signed on. And it was in 1997. And from then forward to, just recently, of course, with Gary's passing, my labels, they just sort of moved with me from place to place. Every new album that they released was released on one of my labels for 20 plus years. And I had the same kind of situation with other artists. So I signed progressives. I signed Justin Hayward from the Moody's, and then I did the Keys to Ascension albums and DVDs with Yes. So I worked that. I did a lot in the metal world. Did a couple albums with Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead. I went back to the 80s and looked for every viable band that survived the emergence of grunge and was still able to tour because their fans were still there. Warren, Dokken, Slaughter, etc., signed all of them. We covered a lot of ground, but we looked for opportunities where other labels underestimated the continuing value of these artists, and where their touring showed that there was a base of fans that had not and would not ever desert them. And we turned that into a business.
So the historical annals are littered with narratives about bands that signed bad deals, never made a dime off some of their most legendary music. I think CCR is one that always comes to mind. We've had John Oates from Hall & Oates on the show a couple times, and John has talked to me several times about how the poor business decisions that he and Daryl made that really led to them having very little to show for their work in the early 80s and the 70s. I would imagine that because there were quite a few bands that made bad contracts, that your ability to help some of these legacy acts find new revenue streams as they aged became even more important because of situations like that.
Exactly. I mean, they're like any other industry. People, clients, and companies that they work with, everyone wants to be respected. I don't care what field you're in, and it's no different in music. The rock stars that are out there, it doesn't matter how high they've been, how far they've fallen, whatever. They want to be respected for what they accomplish, and they feel that they're owed an opportunity for the next chapter, to build the next chapter in their legacy. And I agree. I remember telling Lenny with Motorhead one time, Lemmy with Motorhead, that I would put out a record with him every year as long as he wanted me to. And I knew the business that the record would do. It was a very finite world of fans, but I knew that anything I did with him, from album to album, it would sell the same amount plus or minus maybe 10 units. He had a very hardcore following that was with him. And every year we just sort of, the way we work with artists is we didn't have A&R guys sitting in the studio telling them what to do. I'm like, who am I to tell Gary Rossington what to write? Or, that hook doesn't work for me. So we basically gave them funds and said, you go make the record that you want to make, bring it back to us, and we'll make sure people hear about it. And, and it worked out really well. And yes, the fact that somebody respected them and gave them the tools to do the work with their work without interfering with them while they did it, that was really appreciated. I'll tell you one other story. There's a major 3-piece progressive rock band whose name I won't mention, but you can guess. And I can rember. Do
they have a color in their name? Maybe is there a color in their name potentially?
No, well, I'll tell you what it was. This is a great story. I chased Rush for years across three labels. I kept trying to get up with their manager, Ray, and convince him that, we didn't have the infrastructure. We had a passion that nobody else could replace. He was always very respectful. And he would always say, like, Tom, I'd love to work with you, but, this is a band that feels they need to be in a major label system. Well, fast forward a couple of labels to after I started Loud and Proud a few years in, and it was done as a joint venture with Roadrunner Records, who had been bought by Atlantic, by Warner, but specifically they were housed under Atlantic. And Rush was signed to Atlantic, but I think there were some differences between the band and the label. And at that time, I connected back with Ray and said, look, I really want to work with your band, number one. Number two, guess what? I'm now affiliated with a major. I have a joint venture with a division of a major. Let's talk. So we got together and things clicked. And the thing that pushed the deal over the edge was that particular year when the conversations heated up, and Roadrunner really wanted the band too. I happened to need knee replacements. I had bilateral knee replacements. I had 2 of them at the same time, which was a nightmare. I do not recommend it to anyone listening. Anyway, I had a terrible recovery, and then Rush was entering the final week of touring, and I had wanted to get out, sit with the band, but I could barely walk across the room, much less get on a plane. Anyway, their last dates were at the time, Gibson Amphitheater, out in LA. So I told Ray, before you guys go off and go on hiatus, I really need to, sit with Geddy and Alex and Neil, and let's have a real conversation. So I flew across the first time out of my bedroom was to go to the airport and fly to LA from Raleigh to see Rush. And I go like 2 gates at a time and stop, 2 gates at a time and stop. I made it there. I came out that night. I get with Ray, meet everybody. And then, of course, being with the manager, you don't sit in a regular seat. You go where the soundboard is. And we stood up at the soundboard. Well, that night, as is typical, Rush did a 2-hour set, took a break, and did another hour set. So I spent 3 hours standing on legs that I hadn't stood on since my surgery, basically. And then I went and met the band, and we stood around and talked for like 2 hours. Well, I talked to Ray, I forget at what point, but sometime after that, I remember talking to Ray, and he didn't realize, he knew that I had knee issues. He didn't realize the extent. And one of the things he told me was that they had played a date at Madison Square Garden, and none of the execs from Atlantic Records had come down to spend time with the band. And he said, but you got on a plane when you should have been out of your bed and flew across the country to be able to meet the guys and show them respect. That means the world. And from then on, we just zoom right into the negotiations, put it together. And that album, Clockwork Angels, excuse me, was their second, what charted at number 2, like a hair behind Usher that particular year. And I think it may have been the highest charting debut that they ever had. And it was all because I took time to show respect and personal sacrifice because of how much I really liked the artists and wanted to work with them. And that happens with indie companies. It used to happen with the majors back in the day, but it's different now. It's not about artists. It's about 3 minutes that can be streamed or 4 minutes that can be streamed. So I grew up in a different era. I grew up in the generation that respected albums and complete bodies of works. And in running companies myself, I tried to take that same approach that I felt as a fan and use that as part of the business model.
But you're taking a calculated risk in this. And I'll give you an example. I remember, you and I are probably old enough to remember when Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had their comeback record in the 80s, American Dream. And, it was a terrible record, but it had so much excitement behind it because these guys were getting back together, and Neil Young had left the band in such a strange way in the early 70s. But when you're getting involved with these legacy acts, you're taking a gamble by not having any creative control and giving them full creative control that they're going to produce a winner. And is that a calculated gamble you're taking, or are you relying on a completely different set of metrics in terms of making the decision of who you want to work with?
No, it is a gamble, but it's not a gamble. I mean, when I sit there, back during the course of the years, I would sit there first and pull up their SoundScan history. And I'd look across as many years as I could find data on. And I looked at trends. I looked at, were there spikes when they released a new record? Were there spikes when they started touring? Were there a big drop when they came off the radio? There's a bunch of factors that you enter into the equation. But what really helped me make up my mind was meeting the band and seeing if they had realistic expectations and if they were ready to work to rebuild their audience to the highest level possible. And was it a creditable version of the band? Was it a creditable unit that had enough of the originals, if not all the original members, where it could properly represent the music and where the fans could look at that band on stage and look at the album on a shelf and say, yeah, that's Lynyrd Skynyrd to me. Yeah, that's Bad Company. Yeah, that's that. So, those kind of things mattered more. And then the last piece was, I was a little fish in a very big pond. And, at the time I'm sitting in distribution meetings at BMG where they're talking about, the next, quadruple platinum record. And I'm talking about my releases. So I had to feel like this is something that has a shot at being successful commercially, but just as important to me, because I had this argument with my partners many times. This is something that's so creditable musically that as long as it does reasonably well commercially, that's a win. You know, sometimes you do music for music's sake. You give people a platform like Lemmy, like Motorhead. You give people a platform that have earned the right to have that platform. And then you do the best you can with it. And you lean on their fan base and you try to inch it up a little bit more. It's a gamble. But again, we mitigated the risk, let's put it that way. We mitigated the risk by not expecting groups and not making deals that would require groups to sell a gazillion records. You know, we took the average over years that the bands were doing, put in our intangibles, and we would look at what we thought the floor was of what the business could generate. And we would project a ceiling, but we weren't as much worried about breaking the ceiling. We were more worried about protecting the floor. If we feel this group can do these many tens of thousands of records or hundreds of thousands of records, it's on us then to build a financial model to sign the band, give them the tools, and also do proper marketing and promotion. It's up to us to design a financial model that's different for every band and every release by every band that will support them while keeping us on a reasonable footing. And, you know, it's part gamble, part work.
Now, Tom, is that because that kind of those reasonable expectations on record sales, is that because the money has really shifted these days into, especially for the bigger acts, the legacy acts, into touring, and that's really where the revenue stream is coming from?
Yeah, I think that's the focus of the artists and also the management companies, because that's where the big income is. But recordings are fuel to keep the touring fresh. You know, if the band goes out and plays the same old songs, the same old way year after year, it is going to deteriorate. When you mix in, I mean, Skynyrd was great about mixing in new songs they had written throughout their set along with the classics. You know, they were proud of their new music. Gary Rossington always used to tell me that the best song he wrote was the last one he wrote. You know, I mean, these guys get very juiced by the new music that they're able to write. And in their mind, they're, you know, doing as good a job, their craft is every bit as sharp as it's ever been. Now, commercial acceptance is different. You know, what people's tastes are has varied. I've been through, you know, the grunge era. I've been through all kinds of eras, and these bands continue to survive, and they have ups and downs. It's a roller coaster a bit, but you know, it's just a matter of being smart about the kind of business you do with them. Yeah, I'll give you an example too. You know, people now, there are a lot of people now that do a lot of profit share deals with bands. It's almost like a partnership. It's sort of become, it used to be very unusual. Now it's not uncommon. Well, I was doing profit share deals in the 90s. You know, sometimes with the biggest artists that would have cost X number of dollars for me to sign, I'd approach them a different way and say, look, I can contribute this much to the tools that you need to create your next record. But that's as much as I can contribute, because I'm also contributing this much to do marketing and promotion on the album once it's finalized. So I just can't pay all this up front like you're used to. I said, but what I can do is we can operate as partners. We put our money in, we take our expenses off the top, and whatever's left, half is yours, half is ours. And that resonated with a lot of people. So sometimes being a bit more creative with a financial model was able to make relationships and projects possible that otherwise wouldn't be possible, because they were kind of outside the reach. And sometimes, you know, I was competing with the major label that wanted to re-sign the group. And some of them, you know, jumped for the major label because that's their safe zone. But others were like, I've done that for 25 years. Let's try something different. And, you know, I think it worked out well. And I think it's resulted in a lot of other, you know, managers wanting that type of deal, labels adjusting to the fact that artists have always been underpaid and overexploited. And it's time to show them financial respect, not just creative respect. Yeah, I think things are where they need to be. But back then it was kind of an unusual way to do it. But, you know, again, that was my challenge. It's not up to the artist. The artist says, I want to make this record. Here's what I want to do. Here's where I want to do it. This guy will produce it. I really need this much money. That's their job. And their job is going to record it. My job is to create the resources to help them get that done. And then to have the resources to make sure everybody knows about it and hears about it. Doesn't mean fans will like it. Doesn't mean they'll buy it. Sometimes it's a beautiful album that just didn't sell. But, that's okay. That, keeping it going and doing it properly, that was always my job. And for the most part, I had partners or I worked for people that were really good. With CMC, it was a joint venture with BMG. With Loud and Proud in the beginning, the first 6 years, it was a joint venture with Roadrunner, and they could not have been more supportive. They were fantastic. In the middle, there was Sanctuary, which was self-funded, with that company, which started as the management team for Iron Maiden and still is to this day. Those guys had the ultimate respect for artists because they came up as managers. So to them, the artist is king. Everything else is a tool to help the artist achieve their end result. So they were super supportive, and we did the same thing at Sanctuary as we did with CMC, except it was a much bigger version of the model, and we could reach higher and be even more competitive. When we signed people like Robert Plant, we did 2 albums with Kiss. We did I don't know, did so many groups I had trouble remembering them all. Neil Young, I remember talking to Neil's manager, Elliot Roberts, who's left us unfortunately. And I found out that Russ Never Sleeps, which to me was like a landmark project by Neil, was not being released on DVD when DVDs became popular. It was not being released by Warner. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I said, why don't we let me release it? This was in the early days of DVDs. And he said, yes. So we worked it out. We shipped it double platinum the first day. I'm like, how could you be so connected to Neil Young, a true icon's career for so many years, and not want everything the man creates? But they didn't. But that gave us an opportunity. I can remember sitting in a room at the Sanctuary office in New York when we had this tiny office, and Robert Plant was playing us demos, playing cassettes like piano and vocal, guitar and vocal. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I'm sitting in a room with Robert Plant and he's playing demos for us. It was a surreal adventure in many cases. But there was one common thread, and that's trying to take the time to have a relationship with the artist as a company. Trying to not treat them as selection number 02457, treat them as people, get to know them. When you're at a show and their wives are there, their kids are there, go meet them and talk to them and hang out with them. Talk to them outside of the studio, outside of the tour dates. Just go see them. It's little things that show respect and that create a relationship that independent companies do, that major companies used to do in the early days, but don't so much do anymore.
So look, I want to talk a little bit about emerging acts, because I'm sure you have a lot of wisdom that you can share for anyone's listening that might play music or what have you. And I'm personally passionate about this because I live this lifestyle, and I think it's a point of frustration for a lot of the acts that I speak to. But as we noted before, a lot of the revenue dollars come in touring these days, and especially in the Americana space, you've got, the Americana landscape is littered with quality bands all over the country, all over the world. And also with the lack of radio support for, say, the Americana space and a lot of different spaces, because traditional radio has become so finite in terms of what it plays. I see this from, like, my band. We've got to release music on our own dime. We've got to record music on our own dime. And then we're lucky if we break even when we tour. How do you, if you're counseling emerging acts today, outside of saying you just got to grind at it, because I know that's part of the deal, it seems like the fastest road, and we've had record companies approach us and then tell us this, is get 1 million followers on YouTube and we'll talk. What's the pathway today?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. while music used to be based on artists, and you would look at a career approach to develop that artist over several albums, gradually grow their audience, and do things to make sure that audience sticks, and it's not just a one shot and they're out of there. That used to be the way things were done. But now you're right. It's like when I talk to other people in the industry, it's all about, how many streams do they have? How many Facebook followers? Yeah. Well, they're working on their own out of a garage in, Birmingham, Alabama. How much exposure do you think they've had? How many resources do you think they've been able to put into building their social media presence, generating streams? They do not have the tools that you have, and I keep telling them, it's like, get back to where you start, why you started in this business. Look at their music, feel their music, talk to the people and get an understanding of what they're trying to do. And then think about if they're a good fit with the resources you have that can take often brilliant ideas that need support and turn them into a number of streams, a number of followers. Don't expect the artist to have all that first before you'll invest in them. Find people that have a product that is worthy of investment and support, and then it's your job to exploit that and build the audience. It shouldn't be on the artist to have to build an audience first that's competitive with established groups out there before anybody will touch them. That makes zero sense to me. It's like a record company cannot create what an artist can create, but an artist cannot exploit and grow their brand the way a record company can. So an artist should not expect a record company, to totally understand everything they do creatively. And a record company should not expect an artist to be a marketing machine. There's probably a lot of groups that, creatively are not very deserving of record label attention, but they get that attention because they're a marketing machine. And I know plenty of situations like that where, somebody will approach and they'll be, well, we've got this many followers and this many views on this video. And then I listen to the music and I'm like, oh my God, how? And of course, there are plenty of ways to influence that. There are plenty of companies that can influence results and deliver this and that. So it's not even a realistic picture. It's not genuine. To me, you go out, you listen to a band's music, you like what you hear, you go out and see them, and you see how people react to them. Yeah, you look at the band to see, are they really good live, and how are their chops and all that. But I look at the audience as much as I look at a band. How are they reacting? Is it casual? Do they stop what they're talking about when they start, playing a riff? I mean, is there something between them and their audience that we can cultivate and turn into something much bigger than the environment they're in right now? That to me is how you should decide who belongs on your label, who's on your roster, who do you invest in? Not sit there and look at a statistic sheet and have a processor give you an evaluation of the metrics. It's sad that music has become that way. It's not that way with everyone. It's rarely that way in the independent community, but it is partially that way. And that's a sad statement on how the industry has gotten away from the heartbeat of all of it, which is the song, the artist. That's what should drive every decision.
Let's talk about the other end of the spectrum. So you've got artists like, the biggest artist in the world, Taylor Swift, arguably one of the biggest artists in the world, who's selling tickets for $500 plus for a seat. Or, I recently attended a Springsteen concert, and I was warned before I went to get the tickets that, because of Ticketmaster and what have you, the tickets would be, a couple $100. I was able to get them for about $150 a piece, but still, that's difficult. The Stones are selling $250 tickets. Where does this? I mean, I believe that artists should get what people will pay for them, and those artists are still selling out venues, but it seems to be there has to be some come up and some balance here, and there's these middlemen that seem to be getting in the way that are also inflating prices. Where does this all reconcile, Tom?
I'm honestly no more sure of that than everybody else out there trying to figure it out. The middlemen are a big problem. The the fact that artists are okay with that, which is not true in every case, but the fact that some artists are okay with the extremes their fans have to go to get in a digital line, to even have an opportunity to buy a ticket that's, as much as their car payment or more. It bothers me that artists would allow things to be so mercenary. Yes, there's high overhead on tours. I mean, just the entourages that are required to put on the kind of show that some of these groups put on, the technology that they have to pay for and transport and fund to be able to put on that kind of performance, it's high overhead.
Oh, I mean, a stage setup could be $1 million. I mean, just the stage setup itself.
So it's not that it's a bad deal. It's just the actual cost is really high cost, and it gets higher like everything else. It gets higher every year. I'm more concerned about people, Springsteen, people at the level of a Springsteen or a Taylor Swift. The digital ticket line issue, that's a whole different issue. That's a company.
Sure, that's bots and what have you getting in the way, and
but it's also just
the resale market
not being efficient and being incompetent, not being able to handle their end of the business. But artists at that level, I look at it as they're not just going to a show; it's an experience. To be part of the crowd that saw that, it's worth the extra money, because it's not like you're going to go see that artist every year and buy those tickets every year. You might see the Stones a couple of times in your lifetime. It's too expensive to do it frequently, but it's a moment. It's a moment where I was there in 2023 when Springsteen did this during his show. That's what you're really paying for. But there are a lot of groups that aren't deserving of that kind of financial perspective that are taking advantage of fans. I mean, it's like anything else. It's like this record is priced at $18.99. This one's at $16.99. This guy comes out and he's at $9.99. Well, there are a lot of different tiers in terms of the success, the fan base, et cetera, that apply to artists. It applies when all these companies sign them. They're signing them based on all those different qualities and variables. It's understandable.
It's also subjective too, wouldn't you say? I mean, I wouldn't pay 25 cents to see a Florida Georgia Line show, although I know they just broke up. But I'd pay $200 to go see Steve Earle or Ray Wiley Hubbard, although they'd never charge that. Whereas some people would go pay, gladly go pay $500 to go see a Florida Georgia Line show or something like that, because it's a subjective matter of just their taste in that art form.
Right. No, you're exactly right. I bow to your wisdom on that one.
It's rare that I get to hear that.
You're exactly right. And that again goes to the whole relationship between artists and fans. There are artists that they're more than just a musical artist. They're part of the culture of their group of fans. I mean, Widespread Panic fans, they are living the life that Widespread Panic lives. It's not just let's go see a show. I mean, I can remember I did like 6 or 7 albums with them during the Sanctuary years. And I used to love to go to their shows because the whole parking lot and surrounding area was a village. I mean, there were people that, vendors that camped out and sold their handmade goods and slept there in their truck or on the ground for 3 days while the band was playing it. You go to Red Rocks, it's like they take over the whole community. And that kind of thing, there's probably a different perspective with fans buying those tickets. But then again, the mentality that the philosophy of those types of bands, Widespread Panic would never take advantage of their fans. It's like they do things at a reasonable level so fans can afford to enjoy it. And I'm sure it costs them a lot of money because, they could do 10 nights at Red Rocks. They could double the ticket price. Those same people would still be camped out in that area. But they're sensitive to that. Not all artists are, but some artists are. So my answer is I have no answer. I mean, you got artists that are just really good guys that appreciate the fact that they're set for life, and they decide to do a small venue tour, or they do some festival dates. They do shows where they lower their ticket price and they don't allow, gouging. I can remember bands that would buy part of the house for every show, and part of the house was sold exclusively through their website. And between that and then the portion they would give to Ticketmaster or whoever, there weren't available tickets for people to get involved and play games with. But it's a difficult part of the industry. I don't know where it goes or how it's resolved, other than scaling back shows and reducing the overhead. But now that we've reached a peak, you have an expectation that it's going to be that big a deal, and you're going to have to pay for it. I really can't see where it goes.
Yeah, it's and also I think it's on par with the cost of everything today. Everything just, I mean, whether it's milk or tickets to a show or a football game or what have you, the cost of life is seemingly out of proportion with what Americans and what people across the world are actually bringing home in their paychecks.
And it's everything related to a show. I mean, you're talking about the parking charge, the ticket servicing fee, the price of a beer.
Yeah, getting a beer at a show is $12.
Yeah, it's so ridiculously expensive. Then again, it is with sports too. It's kind of like a rut that we're all stuck in, and either nobody has an answer to how to make it work better between the consumer and the organization and the entertainer, or the sports team. But everybody's living with that, and I don't think anyone feels the need to solve the problem. They're just going to make money as long as they can make money, and the only thing that might lower things would be fans taking a stand, and just don't go to the show, or everybody buy the cheap seats and let the front be empty, and let the artist look out and go, gadzooks, the whole front section's empty.
Yeah.
That's the $300 tickets, and people will spend $30 and sit on the lawn instead.
Well,
I mean,
Tom,
short of something like that. Yeah.
Well, Tom, let's wrap on this. I know your work today has really focused on the kind of deals that we've seen over the last few years with the likes of Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen selling their trove of music. And that's what you have really pivoted your career into now, or at least now you're helping these legacy artists to get revenue streams by selling their catalogs. Talk a little bit about that experience, what you're doing, why you're doing it. I know you can't talk about specific deals, but just give some perspective on what's happening in that aspect of the marketplace for musicians.
Yeah, I think artists, I think veteran artists that have had a long career and have the kind of legacy that the bands you mentioned have, I think they're getting to the point where they want to look out for their families, their kids, their grandkids, whatever. They want to look out for their future, more than just being concerned about what they personally are doing. And this is a tremendous opportunity. I mean, without getting into like specific numbers on specific deals, you can have an artist say, well, I'm 70 years old and I can either spend the next 20 years getting my royalty check every quarter, which will add up to X dollars, or I can sit down with this guy and they will give me, for the rights to my music, 20 years worth of royalties tomorrow. So, do I really want to wait 20 years? Would it be better for me and for my family to do that? What kind of things could I do with that money? Are there are a lot of artists that are like the superstars are very philanthropic. So are there things they could support if they had that kind of, influx of capital? But I think it's really, especially for the veteran artists, there were so many chapters in their story where they were not properly compensated, where their royalties were a joke, where they didn't get the writing credit and royalties that, companies were getting. And then later in their career, things got to be more fair. Well, this is the ultimate fair for artists. This is basically a calculation of how much revenue you're generating, and then a multiple of that annual revenue as your reward for your life's and career's work. So I like the concept of it. And again, it ties to my whole career, having been in a veteran artist field. There are guys that I've worked with and had the honor of working with over the past 3 decades that I believe deserve a payday. They always gave us great music, and they got a lot in return, but not to the level of what the companies made. They didn't get the kind of value that their record company got or their publisher got. They got the shorter end of the stick. Well, this is all about them. This is, it's great when you feel you can do something for an artist and they actually get all the money. It's like donating to a charity and finding out that 10% actually goes to the work that you want to support and 90% is administration costs, which is very frustrating. It's the same way here, to know that when you spend X number of dollars, it's not part of it is going to a ticketing company, part of it is going to some undefinable service fee, all this kind of stuff. It's like all this money is going to the guys that I want to support.
This is the 401k. Is this the 401k?
So I like it for that reason. This is artist money. And it's also a great investment. People have come to realize that intellectual property is a fantastic investment. And we're on the front end of the technology revolution. I mean, streaming has taken off by leaps and bounds. Eventually the rules will get more fair. The financial structure will be more fair. But also there are parts of the world that have barely tapped into it yet. I mean, the growth rates in foreign territories, Latin America, it's like on the front end of an explosion. So there's tremendous room for growth in that space. And, give it a couple years and there's going to be another technology. And there's going to be a whole nother revenue stream. So people investing in this intellectual property that artists have created with a definable financial track record where they can project, on a factual basis, what they believe the revenue will be in the future once they buy it, and allowing for the upside of other new developments in the industry, it's a great investment to make. But for me, it's about bringing something to artists that deserve to get paid. They deserve to be respected financially as well as creatively, and this is a great way to do it. And for whatever reason, I really have enjoyed my whole life working with the generation of artists that came up from, the late 60s forward. That's been my thing from the very beginning. I've really enjoyed the heck out of it. I've found, the majority of these artists to be just great people. I've enjoyed spending time with them, not just doing business with them. So I'm getting a kick out of doing it this way, and it works well. I will tell you I work hand in hand with some people on putting catalog deals together. The last one we did was the master and publishing catalog of B.B. King. And you talk about pride. It's like, here's an artist who never got his due and he's not there to get it, but his family can now benefit from the work that he did all those years, the sacrifices he made, and surviving the lack of respect and the lack of compensation that he really deserved to get. Well, at least now his family will receive the benefits of the work that he did and all that he contributed to music. That kind of thing I get proud of, as well as the business. And I'm hoping to get involved with a lot of the guys I used to work with, and that's what I plan on doing for a while. It's a great thing for them. It's a good thing for me. It's a good thing for the partners that I work with. And it's like the Wild West. It's a wide open market right now. It's a good time. It's a good time for artists.
It's a good time for artists. He's been called the king of classic rock and roll. Tom Lipsky, thank you so much for being on the Loadout Music Podcast. It's been a real treat, a real educational treat to have you on today. And thank you so much, and wish you the best of luck.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate that. See you again sometime.